Next on Link TV, Latin Pulse, news and analysis from Latin America as seen by Latin American media, followed by a panel discussion on the issues. Next on Latin Pulse, only on Link TV.
The following program is an original production of Link TV.
From makeshift baseball games to remote villages in Cuba, Fidel Castro has been admired by many. And for almost 50 years, the island's most polarizing figure. Is Cuba ready for life after Castro?
Patria muerte,
This and more, coming up next on Latin Pulse. Hello and welcome to Pulso Latino. I'm your host, Ana Cuevas. Our topic tonight, Cuba without Fidel Castro.
¡Viva la revolución! ¡Viva Fidel!
In February 2008, the baton was officially handed from President Fidel Castro to his brother Raul. Now, Cuba faces one of its biggest challenges since Fidel Castro took over the island nearly 50 years ago.
January 1959. Fidel and the guerrillas take power. The revolution begins. Rents are cut 50%. The American-owned utilities and telephone are nationalized. The revolutionary government forms a tribunal to try Batista officials. Some 500 are condemned and shot. Most Cubans applaud, but American public opinion is shocked. Charges of communism are hurled at Castro from the United States, while exiled Cubans are permitted to carry out raids from Florida. Tension mounts. Castro charges the CIA with acts of sabotage, including blowing up a munitions ship in Havana Harbor. Hostilities escalate as more American property is nationalized. Congress eliminates the Cuban sugar quota.
Can the revolution continue without its iconic leader? Many, including Fidel's own brother and now president, are making sure the world doesn't forget who the father of the Cuban Revolution was. Here is this report from Mexico's Once Noticias.
Por unanimidad, los 614 diputados del Parlamento cubano eligieron al general Raúl Castro Ruz, nuevo presidente del Consejo de Estado y de Ministros, el máximo órgano del Poder Ejecutivo de la isla.
Asumo la responsabilidad que se me encomienda con la convicción de que, como he afirmado muchas veces, el comandante en jefe de la Revolución Cubana es uno solo. Fidel es Fidel. Todos lo sabemos bien. Fidel es insustituible.
Even though in 2006, Fidel transferred power to Raul for medical reasons, he continued to be the island's official leader. Because of his health, his resignation as president 2 years later came as no surprise. The following report from Colombian broadcaster RCN shows how the world came to know about Castro's resignation via the internet.
Tras 49 años de permanecer en el poder, el legendario líder cubano renunció a su cargo de presidente del Consejo de Estado y comandante en jefe de la isla. En un comunicado publicado en horas de la madrugada por la página web del diario oficial del Partido Comunista Granma, Fidel Castro, el líder que más tiempo ha permanecido en el poder en la historia contemporánea, renunció a la presidencia de Cuba. En la carta dirigida al pueblo cubano y titulada Mensaje del comandante en jefe, Fidel dice que no aspira ni aceptará el cargo de presidente del Consejo de Estado y comandante en jefe, como históricamente lo había venido desempeñando hasta hoy.
As expected, the news prompted big celebrations on the streets of Miami, the U.S. city with the largest Cuban exile community.
Los exiliados cubanos de Miami salieron a las calles de la pequeña Habana a celebrar la renuncia de Fidel Castro. Sin embargo, creen que la posible sucesión del poder a su hermano Raúl representa más de lo mismo.
Aquello si cambia, cambia de mal a peor, pero que cambie no va a haber.
Otros aseguran que la noticia no los sorprendió. Incluso creen que Castro ya murió y son pesimistas sobre cambios radicales en la isla, pues Raúl representa el continuismo. El sentimiento general entre la comunidad cubana en Miami es de escepticismo. Además, no faltaron los ataques personales a Raúl Castro.
Raúl Castro, un borracho y un asesino, nunca podrá gobernar en Cuba.
El exilio cubano en Miami espera que no se presente mayor represión en la isla hacia los grupos que reclaman cambios radicales.
In our studios to talk about Cuba after Fidel, we have Martin Carnoy from the School of Education at Stanford University and Michael Conniff, Director of Global Studies at San Jose State University. And from Washington, D.C., we are joined by Vicki Huddleston, Foreign Policy Visiting Fellow at Brookings Institute. Welcome, and thank you all for being with us here today at Latin Pulse. Let's talk about Fidel's resignation from power. Did this come as a surprise to any of you?
Not really.
Certainly came as a surprise to me. I thought Fidel would have to be dead before he would leave power.
Even though he had been sick for a while?
Well, as long as he could meet with major leaders such as Lula from Brazil and, of course, Chavez, I had thought that perhaps he would hold on to power. For someone like Fidel, it's pretty hard just to give up power.
Mr. Carter, your specialty is in education, and that's one of the areas where Cuba has had international reputation for its educational system. Do you foresee any changes in that area?
No, I think they've got the best educational system up to secondary school in Latin America. And I don't see why they should change it. It's, of course, you could argue that there's not much creativity in that system, and everybody is learning what they're supposed to be learning. But the fact is that they really have good teaching, and the kids are well taken care of, and I don't see any changes at all.
Mr. Khan?
I think where they're behind and they would have to make some major reforms throughout society is in technology. They have not empowered kids to use the internet, to use technology in the classroom and the World Wide Web, and that's I think that's a grave lack in their education, because our kids are using that. It's one of the most powerful teaching, learning tools ever invented. And unless Cuba opens up and uses that tool, those kids are going to be fall behind. At the moment, only the ones who get into university and into technical institutes get access to the web. But I think that's something that they're going to have to change.
But they do have computers in every school. Every school in Cuba, down to the smallest rural school, has a computer. So they're using computers. But Mike is right. They're not using the web. I don't happen to think the web is the greatest learning tool ever invented, but...
However, if you do open it up to the web, you're talking about being able to have ideas leave as well as ideas come back in.
Yeah, so that's it's a very interesting issue if they're going to open up access to the internet. I mean, that would
be wonderful, but it's the same problem of lack of freedom for the Cuban people. And if they would open up to the net, it would change, I think, everything in Cuba, and you kind of draw us then into U.S. policy, because if we had a more open policy and we hooked Cuba up to the web, or we allowed people into Cuba, then probably we would see change taking place much more quickly.
Well, I'd like to remind you that China is open to the web, and political changes aren't exactly booming in China.
But it's a limited opening to the web. There is control from the Chinese.
There's some controls, but in Cuba they just don't have access to the web. It's a very different story.
Worldwide reaction to Castro's resignation was mixed. In Bolivia, President Evo Morales, one of Castro's strongest allies in Latin America, was quick to react to the news.
Quise ver para mí doloroso que el presidente, que el comandante Fidel pida a la Asamblea Nacional de Cuba dejar la presidencia. Primero siento mucho, sentiré muchísimo, porque aprende mucho de él, trabajar por la humanidad y practicar la solidaridad con los pueblos del mundo.
President Bush, on a trip to Africa, says Castro's resignation presents an opportunity for change on the island.
The international community should work with the Cuban people to
to begin to build institutions that are necessary for democracy. And eventually this transition ought to lead to free and fair elections, and I mean free and I mean fair.
The Secretary General of the Organization of American States, the OAS, also sees this as an opportunity for change, but he says it has to come from within and not the result of outside forces.
Mire, yo creo que en Cuba pueden ocurrir muchas cosas, lo único que yo espero que ocurran de manera tranquila y, como digo, como producto de la acción interna, de las decisiones internas del pueblo cubano. Yo creo que sería un error pretender acelerar o empujar cambios sin esa plena expresión. Yo espero que ese sea el camino, un camino de prudencia, sea el que todos los países elijan en esta materia.
In Chile, reaction to Castro's resignation was mixed. Conservatives are hopeful there will be change, while the left prefers continuing Castro's approach, as we see in this report from Chile's Canal 13.
La renuncia definitiva de Fidel Castro a la presidencia cubana rompió el relajo veraniego de la clase política chilena. Todos salieron a opinar sobre un hecho calificado transversalmente como histórico.
Pienso que va a venir un cambio, quizás lento, pero va a venir. Creo que es el momento para que Estados Unidos termine con el bloqueo, con el embargo que hay en Cuba.
La UDI ha sido uno de los partidos más críticos de Fidel Castro, pero hoy hubo espacio para los reconocimientos.
Fidel Castro al final ha sido un dictador, y un dictador nada de benevolente. Sí le reconozco algo, y de eso me alegro. Son los resultados en educación. Y eso hay que reconocerlo y me alegro.
Para la izquierda chilena, Castro es recordado como un aliado incondicional de Salvador Allende durante la Unidad Popular. Enterada de la noticia, la hija del fallecido mandatario destacó la actitud del comandante cubano.
Me parece que habla bien de un líder que reconoce que no tiene todas las capacidades físicas que se requieren para conducir un proceso complejo, obviamente, como es el proceso revolucionario, como lo llama Fidel.
Ms. Huddleston, what do you think will be Washington's strategy towards Cuba?
Well, of course, it will depend on the president, but I would imagine that any president will change the travel restrictions on Cuban Americans. I would hope that almost any president would also allow us to resume migration talks with Cuba. Then I would hope that at least a Democratic president, and so far neither have said they would do so, but they would look at the possibility of lifting the travel ban, licensing travelers, allowing more remittances into Cuba, because in the end, the success of the Cuban people will help the Cuban people become less dependent on the government, and the Cuban people will be less fearful of speaking up and demanding a voice in their governance.
So we're talking about opening up. Mr. Conniff, with the loss of Fidel Castro, he's such an iconic figure. Has Cuba then lost some of its international clout?
I don't think so. I think there's a fascination with Cuba in this country and Europe and all over the world. People want to go and see it. It's really, having survived all these decades under Fidel, everyone wants to go and see it. And I think tourism is, if it were to return, if Americans could go as tourists, it would make a terrific impact on the island. The people-to-people relationships that could evolve. But sad to say, neither the Democratic Congress this year nor the candidates seem to be moving in that direction. The issue seems to be caught up in the, who's tougher on national security than the other. And so, even though Cuba's never been a threat to American security, still they have to sound tough on Cuba to stand tall in the election.
And I'm afraid that Florida will be in play in the election, and so the Cuban policy will be held hostage to what happens in Florida, which is really a very strange way to do foreign policy, but unfortunately political reality. And so the question is, I think Fidel's resignation opens a window for everybody, for them and for us. And under other circumstances, it would seem clear that the Democratic candidates would start saying, and Obama has already said it, that he wants to begin a dialogue without conditions, and Hillary has said that she wants to open a dialogue, but under some set conditions.
Does this mean then the end of the Cuban Revolution as we know it?
Well,
I don't think so, not as long as there's a one-party state, but I think that we will see gradual reform, and it will be mainly economic reform. but you'll still see very much the party in control. It will be democracy within the party, if you can call that democracy.
Two of the areas where Cuba scores high points is in its healthcare and its education system. However, the standard of living leaves a lot to be desired. Can Raul Castro improve the standard of living to, in some way, appease the people?
Not without expanding the GDP, and that's going to come very, very slowly because of the embargo. If the embargo were lifted, trade were to develop, Cuba has a tremendously capable and well-educated middle class. If that middle class were unleashed to be productive, there's really no limit to what they could do. But until that happens, there will only be incremental increases in the GNP, and it'd be very hard to take from investment to raise the standard of living. There will be increases, but in the 5 to 10% range, not anything really dramatic.
Ms. Huddleston.
Well, having lived in Cuba for 3 years, I'd like to go back to that question about what the Cuban people want, because I can assure you, and the polls show it, the Gallup poll, that they want a lot more freedom. They also want to make more than the equivalent of $15 to $17 a month. And because they are well educated, they want to have the access to internet. They want to have access to travel. We saw recently a conversation between the president of the National Assembly, Alarcón, and students who are saying, we want to travel. And we want to be able to buy toothpaste that doesn't cost us the equivalent of 3 days' salary. So Cubans really do want change, and that's what Raul's going to have to respond to.
But how fair is it to blame the conditions and the standard of living on the embargo, just the embargo?
Well, partially fair, partially not fair. If you didn't have an embargo, I'm sure there would be a lot of United States investment going in. As one of the participants just said, there'd certainly be a lot of tourists going down to Cuba, and so Cuba would be a richer nation. But what I blame the embargo for is the lack of information, the lack of freedom, because I think we help Cuban state security keep people from knowing what's really going on in the world and learning how they can take charge of their own destiny.
Mr. Harnoy, we just saw a Chilean conservative center indicate that Fidel has done very well in educating the people. Is there anything that Raul Castro can do to undo what his brother has been able to do?
I don't think so. I think that, well, one of the reasons that they have been able to do so well, of course, is because Cuban teachers, like everybody else, gets paid about the same salary, this $15 a month in terms of Cuban pesos. And so people who go into teaching because they want to be teachers, rather than because they want to, they choose occupations on the basis of what they want to do, not because of salary. If he would free up the salary scales, he'll face the same problem as China and Eastern Europe, in which it would be much harder to recruit good teachers into teaching. And they're having this problem a little bit now with the tourism industry in certain provinces. It's very hard to recruit people who go into teaching because they'd rather be chambermaids in hotels. So it could change, and a great increase in tourism, I guarantee, would make it very much harder to recruit people into teaching.
So what changes will likely happen under Raul Castro's administration? The first hint came days after he took power. As a communist nation, Cuba has long restricted the Catholic Church's influence. In an unusual step, the new government welcomed a high-ranking envoy from the Catholic Church.
El presidente del Parlamento, Ricardo Alarcón, y el canciller Felipe Pérez Roque, encargado de recibir al cardenal Tarcisio Bertrone, quien dio un voto de confianza al nuevo gobierno.
Todos juntos, yo creo, el nuevo presidente Raúl, el nuevo Consejo de Estado, la Iglesia Católica misma, las otras iglesias, intentan reconocer, a percibir las aspiraciones del pueblo.
A few days later, Cuba went a step further by subscribing to the UN's Declaration on Human Rights, signaling the new Cuban administration may be open to change.
El canciller cubano Felipe Pérez Roque firmó en Nueva York el Pacto Internacional de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales y el Pacto Internacional de Derechos Civiles y Políticos de Naciones Unidas. El pasado, desde diciembre, Día de los Derechos Humanos, el gobierno cubano había anunciado que suscribiría estos pactos internacionales como compromiso de Cuba con los postulados de ambos instrumentos. Los activistas por los derechos humanos dentro del país caribeño valoraron como positiva esta firma, pero creen que aún queda un largo camino por recorrer antes de que se pueda hablar de mejoras en este terreno.
Government officials in Washington say little has changed other than the first name. They say this is still a Castro administration, as we see in this report from Univision.
El Departamento de Estado afirmó que no habrá cambio de política ni se levantará el embargo de 4 décadas. El secretario Carlos Gutiérrez copreside la comisión para asistir a una Cuba libre.
Esto no significa ningún cambio, eso es un traspaso de un título de un dictador a otro. Fidel Castro sigue ejerciendo su influencia y manejando todo. Sigue la misma dictadura, sigue la misma opresión, sigue la misma crueldad.
Many agree that if there is going to be change in Cuba, it has to come from the Cuban people themselves.
Los cambios tienen que venir de ahí y tiene que venir del pueblo, no puede venir de otra parte. Y si los cubanos no se ponen de pie, pues bueno, viviremos otros 50 años más con el que pongan, sea Raúl, sea el que sea.
And some younger Cubans seem to have faith in Raul. They believe he can fix what they say is wrong in their country.
Después, nuestro comandante Fidel Castro es la mejor persona indicada para ser nuestro presidente y organizar todo lo mejor posible en el país. Que esté desorganizado sea Raúl.
But as we see in this report from Mexico's Once Noticias, Raul Castro faces a huge challenge. He needs to improve the country's standard of living, especially among the younger generation.
Quizá el reto más apremiante que enfrenta el gobierno es mejorar las condiciones de vida de la población, en particular los jóvenes.
Lo único que a nosotros nos gustaría, como han dicho la gente, que es viajar, conocer, un poquito que mejorar el nivel de vida, pero nada más. Y seguir aquí, que es todo lo que nos gusta, aquí en este país, Cuba libre.
De los 11.4 millones de habitantes en la isla, 2.2 millones nacieron después del 92. Estos jóvenes no saben ni quién es Fidel Castro, ni le importa hoy en día, y menos le importa qué gobierno le va a dar Raúl Castro.
Mr. Conniff, what about being able to improve the standard of living for Cubans?
Well, they certainly deserve it, and when we go there to visit, it's excruciating to visit families who are doctors, university professors, administrators, and so forth, and find how poorly they live. They can't even have a car, their homes are run down, and yet they have wonderful spirit and warmth toward us and toward outsiders, and they have a spiritual richness. But the physical survival of the Cuban middle classes is really in question.
But they are healthy and well educated.
Yeah, that's true. Right.
And the kids look great, and it's wonderful to see them in school. You don't see any real poverty in the street.
That isn't really true. I mean, it seems to be true, but I've been in many Cuban homes, especially in the center of the city. And people live in dismal conditions, just dismal. You know, they put these things between the front room and the bedroom that are just, you know, like dividing up the kitchen so that people have a place to sleep. Housing is very poor.
So what can the world expect for a Cuba without Fidel?
I think all three of us agree that it'll be very gradual change, that Raul is not going to institute major reforms. The biggest change would come if the United States would normalize relations with Cuba. That would make a tremendous impact. No one knows what the outcome would be, but I think, and most of my friends think, that's the healthiest way to proceed.
We just heard a political analyst say the younger generation of Cubans don't really know who Fidel is or don't really know about the Cuban Revolution. How much of a problem is this then for this new leadership that's coming in?
I think it's a big problem. 2.2 million kids have been born since the 1990s. And I remember once picking up a group of kids in this beautiful car I was driving. And they said, where did you get the car? And I said, well, it belongs to the United States government. They said, oh, be our mother and take us to Miami. So I think our problem, really, and it's a Cuban problem too, is to help Cubans have better lives in Cuba so that those young people want to stay there.
Yeah, because Mr. Carno, this is a very restless group then, and they're going to demand change, or that's what's expected.
I agree totally with Vicki, and I think that it's going to pose a problem to keep these Cuban kids from getting access to information, getting to travel, as she said, and how they handle that is going to be important. But it's very important for us as a nation to relate to this country right offshore in a completely different way than we have in the past. And in fact, that would not only help the Cuban people, but it would also help the transition. Our present policy is based on an all or nothing. It's either got to be our way or the highway. And that's completely in, I would say, a dark ages type of policy.
So it is a wait and see attitude, both what's going to happen in Cuba and what's going to happen in the United States. I trust you enjoyed today's program. I'd like to thank our guests here in San Francisco, Martin Carnoy from the School of Education at Stanford University, and Michael Conniff, Director of Global Studies at San Jose State University. And in Washington, D.C., Ms. Vicki Huddleston, Foreign Policy Visiting Fellow at the Brookings Institute. I also want to thank you at home, or if you're joining us on the web, for being with us today. We also want to thank American University in Washington, D.C., and the students at the School of Communication for helping research this program. Join us next time when we take a closer look at Latin America through the eyes of Latin American media. For more information about Pulso Latino and Latin America, log on to linktv.org. I'm Ana Cuevas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time here on Latin Pulse.
Latin Pulse was made possible by support from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Pulso Latino es posible gracias al apoyo de John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation y el William and Flora Hewlett Foundation.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs that connect you to the world.